Hi, welcome to Max in Minutes from Focal Press and 3dforgames.com. In this video, we're going to look at some common techniques employed within the video games industry to create vegetation. What follows initially will not be program specific but covers the basic process of creating some plant and grass models. It's very important to do some research and find some good images of leaves, plants and foliage before starting any models, as this will make the task a lot easier. We're going to start small and look at the basic techniques of creating grass to be used in game. Most game engines can't afford to model every leaf or blade of grass, so the solution used is applying textures with alpha maps or alpha channels to simple geometry. Alpha maps are black and white or grayscale images which, when used in a diffuse texture, show any elements in white as being opaque and black as being transparent. All grey values will create relevant levels of transparency. For example, 50% grey is taken as 50% transparent. We'll now look at creating some grass with this technique. The diffuse or colour map can be created from photos, scans of grass, or in this case I took a render from 3D geometry, which also gave me an accurate alpha channel. If we go to the channels option in Photoshop, below the RGB channels we'll see the alpha channel. When I select it, you'll see the shape of the grass in white, so any pixels on the diffuse texture that are under the white pixels of the alpha channel will be visible. Any pixels under the black areas will be see-through. The alpha channel is displayed in Photoshop as a solid colour. In this case, it's displayed red when viewing all the channels at once. You can double click on the alpha channel to adjust the display properties in Photoshop, like changing the colour and opacity. If you want to use a photo to create the texture, you can do this by opening the file and creating a new alpha channel by selecting the Create New Channel option on the Channels tab. It will appear solid black, so fully transparent. We now need to paint the white or opaque areas of the image we want to be visible. Painting the white areas of the alpha channel can be done in many ways. One is the simple but slow method of painting it manually. You can use the various lasso, magic wand and other selection tools to select the areas and then paint them also, or even a mixture of these techniques to speed up the process. When this is complete, we'll need to get the diffuse texture with the alpha channel saved out with a format that stores the alpha information. These formats include BMP, PNG, TIFF and DDS. Also, depending on whether the engine or 3D software supports files with an alpha channel information, you may need to copy and paste the alpha channel back into the RGB layers and save it as a separate file to be used in a shader as a separate texture. This can be done by pressing Ctrl-A over the alpha channel to select it all, then Ctrl-C to copy the selection, and Ctrl-V on a new layer in the Layers tab to paste it, and then save the file as a separate texture after flattening the image. If you know a separate texture is required, you could just create it on a separate layer and not use the alpha channel from the start. Now that we have a texture, we can move into 3ds Max and look at some examples of grass. In the scene here, I have planes with the alpha texture already applied. As most of the textures are square, I've used a square plane. The goal with creating grass is to make the model cheap, as it will be used a lot. But it also needs to be viewed from different angles. It's always important to keep this in mind when creating vegetation for games and use a solution that suits your requirements. The first example in the middle is a single plane set to double-sided, so that the texture displays on both sides. This doesn't work very well in a 3D environment as it's flat. This means that as soon as I rotate the camera, it's not visible from the sides or top. To make the texture on the model double-sided, press M to bring up the material editor, and in Shader Basic Parameters check two-sided. The solution to add depth to the model is to create another plane and rotate it 90 degrees and create some cross planes. This is the next example. It now looks okay from most angles. We can then elaborate more on this and create many cross planes, as we have in the third example, which uses 4 planes, all rotated by 45 degrees. This looks a lot fuller than the cross plane solution, but will be slightly more expensive. The grass can now be viewed from any side, but the view from above is still an issue. Usually this is resolved by having a grass texture beneath the model. Here I've set up a plane and more grass to give an example how it may look in game. I've used the cross-plane method and made many copies. I rotated and scaled copies, positioning them to create this patch of long grass. This all looks okay except the hard edge where the planes meet the ground. Our way around this is to return to the alpha channel or texture map and fade out the bottom of the grass using a brush set to low opacity. Paint along the bottom of the edges of the grass to fade it upwards. Only do this along a small area around the edge. When we go back into max, you can see the difference. The faded edge sits better on the plane and is less noticeable. This concludes our grass creation part of the tutorial. Next, let's look at a few more examples and ways to organise the polygons. These are not necessarily the most optimal methods, but can give interesting results. Don't be afraid to experiment with various combinations to see what works best. There are other methods and extra steps that many current games use to improve the look of grass. These include lighting it better, or even animating it to sway in the wind, and even move when interacted with. The steps shown here are designed to get you started. Now we'll move on and take a look at some plants. They'll be created in a similar way as the grass using alpha maps and geometry. First, I'll discuss the approach I use to break down the complex shapes of the plants before starting. I have 2 photos for reference. One of a small plant with a few leaves, and the second a slightly larger plant with denser foliage. At first, these forms seem very complex. I'll start by simply breaking them down to component pieces. This process can be applied to any object you wish to create. Let's look at this as if we were drawing it. The approach is to reduce complex shapes back to simpler shapes that are easier to understand. At this stage, I tend to quickly sketch possible geometry arrangements that might suit the plant. I've put together a few images ranging from the reference on the left to the silhouette of the final models on the right. In between are the quick sketches I did to get a feel for the shape of the stem and leaves and characteristics I wanted to get into the model. For example, how it grows, how the weight of the leaves cause the stem to start bending down as it grows away from the centre, and also the way the leaves bend and fold. In the sketch of the larger plant, I've noticed how the stems grow upwards and then fall away from the centre back towards the ground. The stems closest to the ground are more horizontal, with the ones higher being the more vertical. I'll start with the small plant first. I've already created a texture from a photograph using the same method as before. After painting the alpha channel, I also removed the original background and painted it green to match the leaf. This was then copied to a new layer on its own by selecting the alpha channel and pressing Ctrl A to select only the opaque or white areas. Then select all the RGB channels and press Ctrl J to copy the selection. This should then separate the leaf from the background of the photo. I left room at the bottom of my image for a tiled strip to map the stem, so I only use one texture map for the plant. Moving to the 3D model example, first we'll look at the leaves. I've created 5 examples with the texture applied. On the left, a flat plane, which can be useful, but is not very interesting to look at. We need to add volume to it. The first step was to add an edge down the centre as seen in the second example. I then moved this edge up to create a nicer shape to the leaf. Again, it still suffers from a straight edge down the centre. In the next example, I added another edge, cutting across the first edge, and I moved the central vertex up to improve the shape. Now it looks good from most angles. All of these examples are valid to use. It depends on what the polygon count restrictions you may have and what angles the plant will be viewed from, to which you'll choose. The other two examples don't really improve the shape, but are more an attempt at optimization. In these examples, I just cut around the leaf from the third example. The reason for this is that using alpha textures can be expensive, as the game engine needs to consider every pixel, even the transparent ones. This is called overdraw. So with the first example, the renderer needs to make calculations for all of the area around the leaf. To reduce this, I cut around the leaf, reducing the amount the engine needs to calculate, but the trade-off is that I have added geometry. This is not a strict rule, as it depends on the game engine, but it's worth knowing in case you ever need to do this. The last option has 8 triangles, like the third example. It's a good shape and the least amount of transparency to draw. Now we have some leaves to use, we need a stem. I've created a 3-sided cylinder and added 2 edge loops in the centre. I selected the central vertex on the cap or end and moved it up to create a point. I then selected all the edge loops and scaled them slightly to taper the stem. I then copied this shape and bent it to match the shape in the reference image in the sketch. I kept making duplicates and modelling them, making sure all the stems grew from a central point. Finally, we need to take our leaf and make some copies. I scaled some in the X and Y axis to create a few shapes and then positioned and rotated them at the ends of the stems following the photo reference. After this was complete, I combined the pieces into a single mesh. There is another example using the cheaper second version of the leaf. The most expensive version comes out at 350 triangles and the cheaper one at 250 triangles. Next, we'll take a look at the second plant from the reference images. I used the same texture and process to create this one, but I've given it a different form to match the reference image. The leaves have also been approached differently. Instead of adding the kink down the centre, I opted to create leaves that curved around. I also cut them out, just as we did in the last example, to reduce the area of transparency overdraw. Again, if this isn't required by the game engine, we could leave them as the bent rectangular plane. This time, I've also mixed in some cheaper leaves to help fill the plant out, without using too many polygons. From these two examples, you should see that it's possible to get a few different types of plants from one texture map. The problem with this approach is that the leaf repeats and there is only one. We also need geometry for each leaf. So if we were to want denser foliage, we would just need to add more polygons. The next example, we'll have a look at improving on this. For this example, I'm going to return to the texture and change the layout to allow us to have a denser, more varied plant. I took the existing texture and copied the leaf to a new layer and scaled it. I split the texture into 4 sections, leaving the tiled stem texture at the bottom. In these new sections, I made variations of the leaf. One with a yellow rim, one thinner and longer, and a smaller section with leaves grouped together. All of these will add variety and increase the number of leaves on the plant. This technique of laying out the texture with all the different sections can be used to have one texture sheet containing many types of foliage. This sheet can then be shared across a lot of plant models to give a lot of variety. This could even be used to have various stages of decay for a plant, from fresh growth to withered and dying leaves. Moving back to 3ds Max, we can now compare this new texture to the previous plant. I'll first show the range of leaves I used to put the plant together. Again, I'm using the same techniques as before. Moving across, you can see the new plant model, which has the same polygon count as the previous one, but looks fuller and has more variety. When positioning the leaves, I constantly moved the camera around the model to make sure that there were no large gaps or empty areas on the model, ensuring it will look good from almost any angle. Of course, if it had gone further and created a texture with lots more leaves, it would be more like a bush than a plant and probably look even fuller but require less geometry. For the final example in the video, I've created a bushier plant using the same concept of a diffuse texture with an alpha channel. This time I'm not going to use any model stems, but instead we have created a texture with lots of leaves and branches. As modelling stems can look okay, it usually takes a good few polygons to have interesting smooth shapes. The downside to this method is having so many planes that the model may not look great in game, but this does depend on the engine's lighting system. This approach will make it very quick and easy to fill out a plant, bush or even a tree if it was created on a larger scale. The example on the left is only 14 triangles. I started with a cross plane and then made 5 more planes and positioned them all to intersect each other and cross the planes. I then rotated the faces to fill out the bush from the front, side and back views. The last adjustment was to rotate the faces back away from the central cross planes. This helped in filling out the bush from the top view also. The second example on the right was created in the same manner using planes, with the texture applied, but it also has more geometry. I added 2 edges to some of the planes, one vertical and one horizontal. I then moved the vertices off the plane to give the bush a curvier, more organic look. Creating all the vegetation and world assets are only part of the task. The same approach of building the plants to make them look more detailed and fuller than they actually are can also translate to the environment they go into and how you arrange the scene. When placing the plants in the scene, consider how they will be viewed by the player. Think about what angles you'll see them from and how close the camera will get to the objects. All of this information will influence how you arrange and create assets for your environment. In this scene, I've chosen a set camera angle to display the models and place the smaller to medium vegetation at the front and the larger bushes in the back. Straight away this creates a sense of depth and fills the screen quickly. I try to overlap assets to cover as much space as possible, but I only put in what's needed. What would really help sell this scene would be to have trees and larger forms of vegetation in the background, and maybe even the foreground. These will be covered later in the series. Okay, let's finish with a quick recap of some of the tips that have been covered that you may find useful. Always create the plant to suit the project you're working on. This should dictate the polygon and texture budgets for the approach you take to create them. Consider which angles the vegetation will be seen from and create it to look its best from the desired angle. If the asset is viewed from all angles, make sure there are no large gaps in the foliage or branches from any angle. If the shape of the plant is complex, break it down to more manageable components and then put it back together, taking into consideration the overall shape and flow of the plant. If you have the resources, you could go a step further and create normal and specular maps for the plants too. When arranging all the assets in a scene, if possible, put the effort into the area the players will see first or see the most. Consider that any plant created may be used a lot in a game, sometimes hundreds of times. For this reason, it's always best to keep a close eye on the polygon count for each asset and ensuring they are fairly consistent and efficient. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next guide. For support with this video and any of the others in the range, log on to www.3d4games.com/forum and your questions will be answered once you've logged in. Good luck and goodbye.